When it comes to Disney's infamous obsession with plot twist villains, it's generally agreed that most of their attempts at it didn't really turn out all that well. Though the unspoken reason for this may very well come down to the fact that around the same time Disney started doing twist villains, they also started copying Pixar's style of storytelling a lot more rather than using their own. Because when you look at it, twist villains are actually a staple of Pixar movies, but very few seem to have the problems that Disney did. And today, rather than going over for the 100th time why Disney was better off sticking to their tried and true formula when it came to villains, I would instead like to go over why it's generally agreed that Pixar handles twist villains a lot better. And there will be major spoilers for a ton of Pixar movies ahead. So in case there's a movie of theirs that you don't want ruined, you should probably proceed with caution. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so to get the obvious out of the way first, the main reasons people often complain about Disney twist villains are mainly due to a combination of the twists feeling as though they come out of nowhere and therefore throw the previous actions of said characters into question rather than clear them up, and in some cases leave the movie without a villain for most of its runtime when it would have benefited from having one from the start. And when you look at Pixar's plot twist villains, they generally tended to avoid these problems. And not to mention, very few of Disney's twist villains from the 2010s were considered all that memorable. Whereas once the twist is revealed, it can be extremely difficult to forget Pixar's villains. And to perhaps best demonstrate my point here, let's take a look at a few of Pixar's twist villains, starting with their first two, the Prospector from Toy Story 2 and Henry J. Waternoose. And not only do both of these twists work because they're executed very effectively, but also because they accurately reflect their characters' actions beforehand. Like, while the Prospector, for example, presents himself as a pillar of wisdom and understanding, there are subtle hints that he's more desperate to go to Japan than he lets on. Particularly in the scene where Woody's ready to leave. He tries to get him to stay, both by talking to Jessie and then giving a speech on Andy growing up, all the while glorifying the idea of spending eternity in a museum when that doesn't work. And note the look of delight when Woody decides to stay. It betrays the fact that he's a lot more invested in Woody's decision than he appears. And of course, there was also the question of how the TV did turn on if it wasn't Jesse, as well as how he sounds pretty suspicious when he claims not to know how it happened and is quick to change the subject. All of this helps to explain his actions once Woody decides to go back to Andy, which is then only compounded by his explaining why he's so desperate to go to Japan, especially because it matches up with what had been mentioned about him beforehand. And the same goes for Henry J. Waternoose. He presents himself as a father figure to Sully, but at the same time, he makes it crystal clear that he's willing to do anything to keep the company from going under. As a result, when he's revealed to be not only in on Randall's scheme, but pretty much the whole mastermind at that, it makes total sense. But the other thing that both these villains have going for them is that there were other villains to carry the movie before the twists are revealed. Because Al and Randall cause most of the movie's conflict, they're able to make up for the fact that the true villain isn't revealed until towards the end by filling that role instead. And not only does that allow both movies to function better because there is some kind of bad guy from the start, but it also makes their respective twists even more shocking because the audience is a lot more likely not to see them coming. Or for another example of that, in The Incredibles, the plot twist isn't so much that Syndrome is the bad guy, but more so the fact that he was Mr. Incredible's devoted fanboy from the prologue. But once again, the reason this works is because it ties into the theme of the film and allows the two to have a much deeper connection. Because not only is Syndrome technically the consequences of Mr. Incredible being cold to a fanboy coming back to bite him, but it also serves as an interesting motivation for the villain. Instead of envying superheroes and wanting powers or just out to be rich, Syndrome holds a personal hatred for the idol that rejected him and wants revenge, as well as have him feel exactly what he felt. And he makes it clear that he'll do anything to achieve that particular goal. So once again, the reason the twist works is because it's one that is heavily warranted by the narrative, to the point that the movie would arguably much worse off by not having it. But then with their next three twist villains, things get interesting. Because Otto, Charles Muntz, and Lotso are all alike in the fact that their movies' respective conflicts are caused without a villain, and only step into the picture once that conflict needs to be escalated to a breaking point. But what makes them work is in part because they do that job very effectively. Like in the case of Otto, if he wasn't pushing to stay in space, the movie would be left without an emotional resolution. They would have just put the plant in and gone home, and bang, the end. But because Otto refuses to make that task simple, it allows both the humans to have to work for the privilege of fixing their home world and show that they've learned, as well as for Wally and Eve to be able to prove their love for each other in no uncertain terms. And not to mention, Otto's actions are also justified by his being a robot who refuses to go against his programming. So it makes sense that he'd go to such irrational extremes to fulfill it, because he feels he has to. He's almost like an anti-Terminator taken to the extreme. And because the same thing pretty much applies to Charles Muntz and Lotso, with them I want to focus on a slightly different aspect that adds to their appeal as villains, which is that once they're revealed to be the bad guy, they show themselves to be truly horrible. I mean, none of Disney's other obsession with trying to make their villains sympathetic is present here, as they might just be two of the most depraved villains ever put in an animated movie. Though, ironically, some are actually inclined to feel more sympathetic, in part because the narrative is so harsh in their judgments of them. Though, if you ask me, it's more justified in the case of Charles Muntz, as even if he's clearly insane, he was driven to that point by being unfairly disgraced and then eluded by a freaking bird for 60 years. It most certainly doesn't justify his actions by any means, but most would have to admit that's a little rough. But setting that aside, the point is that part of what makes Muntz so good as a villain is that sheer insanity and how dangerous he is because of it. By the events of the movie, we've come to see a great adventurer pushed past his breaking point all because he wanted to regain the honor he deserved. and it's both horrifying and fascinating to see. Seriously, Munt's characterization was definitely one of Pixar's more effective uses of realism in one of their movies. But the same goes even more so for Lotso. Now, some might bring up that unlike most of Pixar's other twist villains, his betrayal could be seen coming a mile away, especially since it was pretty much an open secret before it ever came out that he was the bad guy. But the reason this works, where Disney's more obvious attempts at it didn't, is because Pixar doesn't even bother with the charade for too long. Again, they even revealed it in the marketing of the movie. Instead, they just put up the pretext of him being friendly long enough to justify why the characters would trust him, and then immediately drop it once that's firmly established. And in the process also allows the movie to have a villain from pretty early on. Again, in this case it's not for shock value so much as necessary for the story so that the characters will initially let their guard down around him. Because with Lotso, it's not so much that he is the villain, but just how depraved he really is. That's the true twist here. Because as I was saying before, what not only makes Lotso such a great villain, but also a terrifyingly memorable one, is just how horrifyingly evil he turns out to be. Again, he may just be one of the most vile, evil villains ever attempted in a kid's movie, and it's specifically because he isn't outright sadistic or a blatant mass murderer. No. Instead, he's a pretty accurate representation of what an actual dictator is like. Selfish, power-hungry, evil, and above all, miserable. Because that's another interesting thing about Lotso. Nothing he does actually makes him happy, other than maybe in the exact moment he's destroying the attachment between a toy and his owner. He's horrible, he's sadistic, but it's all in the name of maintaining power and keeping anybody from questioning him. And what makes all of this even worse is that this mentality actually makes sense if you look at it from his perspective. I mean, he's a complete nihilist who genuinely believes that a toy's only purpose is to be thrown out and destroyed. So what does he have to be happy about? And that's why he so desperately clings to the little power he has, because he wants to prolong that day of being thrown out for as long as he possibly can. And what makes him so horrible is that while doing all of this, he also goes out of his way to make everybody see things his way, whether they want to or not. My point is it really any wonder why people remember this character and why he's been hailed as such a great villain? I mean, a sadistic teddy bear running a daycare like a dictator is one thing, but a toy broken by his owner's abandonment to the point that he throws away all of his morals and gives into full-blown nihilism, and to such an extent that it not only gives him an extreme fear of death and need for power, but also compels him to try and make every toy he comes across feel as hopeless as he does? It may be a bit much for a kid's movie, but there's a reason Lotso is considered by many to be perhaps the darkest villain in Pixar history. And honestly, everything I just said about Otto, Charles Muntz, and Lotso could also apply to Ernesto de la Cruz as well. Because again, he arguably doesn't cause the main conflict, but his inclusion does end up adding a lot of thematic significance. And not to mention, similar to Lotso, what also helps in his case is just how cruel he is following the reveal, especially because unlike all the other examples who can elicit a degree of sympathy from the audience, Ernesto de la Cruz has absolutely none of that going for him. He's just a man that wants success at any cost, and he means at any cost. And that's why he was able to stick out so much, even at a time when audiences were starting to get tired of the twist villain trend. Since it's not only well executed, serves the story, and lines up with his earlier actions and behavior instead of calling them into question, but because of how well he works as the villain after that. He doesn't attempt to apologize or backtrack. No. Instead, he commits to trying to keep his secret no matter what that entails, and in the process shows just how much of a worthless piece of trash he really is. He genuinely makes the audience come to hate him by the time he's crushed by that bell through his appalling actions and senseless justifications alone, and all of that is completely intentional on the writer's part. And what only makes him even more memorable in this department is that there are several celebrities in real life that can be seen as a parallel to him, appearing to be nice and humble, but were actually jerks who did horrible things to get where they wanted to. The point is, somebody like De La Cruz could definitely exist in real life, and arguably has, which is what makes him even more terrifying, but also believable. Now, obviously, there are other examples of Pixar twist villains I could go over, but I think I've proven my point here. That simply put, Pixar is just better at executing plot twists involving the villain, and was something that Disney was never really able to get a handle on. But what really helped most of Pixar's twist villains was that they're allowed to be both their own characters and villains beyond the twist itself. Because that was arguably Disney's biggest problem with their twist villains, that beyond thematic significance, they were trying to characterize the villains by the fact that they were twist villains, rather than the twist revealing their true character that they then get to display. Like Professor Callahan and Dawn Bellwether, for example. Nothing is really added to their characterization after their respective plot twists, and instead, the plot twist becomes their characterization. As in, they're only defined by the fact that everybody thought they were a good person, but aren't. And just contrast this with Ernesto de la Cruz of the same era, who after the reveal shows just how much of a cowardly sociopath he truly is, and makes it abundantly clear that he believes the ends justify the means no matter what. Simply put, the twist adds to his character, not becomes it. To put it all another way, when Pixar adds a plot twist to one of their movies, whether it actually involves the villain or not, they're doing it for a reason. It's well thought out and actually serves the narrative to have it be a twist. But Disney's attempts at plot twists, particularly in the 2010s, have felt a lot more like twists just for the sake of twists. And as I went over in my video on plot twists, which you can find a link in the description to, that almost never works in the end. I mean, sure, there are a few plot twists in Disney movies that were actually done really well, but on the whole, it's clearly something that Pixar is much better at. And because of that, the reception behind the two studios' respective attempts at twist villains really speak for themselves. Okay, I think that pretty much ends this video. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that twist villains are something that should remain strictly a Pixar thing, and that Disney should stick to having traditional villains like they're known for? Or do you believe Disney's attempts to twist villains have been just as good as Pixar's? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because as I always say, you do not have to agree with this video if you don't want to. You can feel about both Disney and Pixar's twist villains that you want to, and if you think I had it all wrong, that is absolutely fine. And thank you all for watching. I very much appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.